Hi, my name is Michelle and I'm going to be giving a presentation on gait development. So basically, what is gait? Gait is the manner in which an individual walks. Everyone is different. No one has a perfect gait cycle or anything like that. There's many factors that play into that, things such as age, abnormalities, and things of that nature. We have 4 different stages of development, which include early childhood development, adult development, and older adult development. So before I start discussing this gait cycle and the different stages of development, I did want to go over the theories of development just because there are so many theories out there that try to explain why we do certain movements that can relate to the gait cycle and our everyday life. So using some of the theories that come from the textbook, I use some of those to relate them to each stage of development. So for early childhood and childhood development, I chose the information processing theory, which basically states that our brains act like computers. We take in information, we process it, and then we make a movement based off of that. And I chose that for those 2 stages of development simply because as a young child and a toddler, they mostly learn through observation, whether it's from their parents, an older relative, or anyone around them really. So they basically see them performing a movement and they try to mimic it in any way. Moving through the stages of development, the theory I chose for adulthood was maturational perspective, which basically states that your genes and your hereditary are primarily responsible for your motor development and that your environment has little to no influence on that. So basically, I chose this because in adulthood, you're already so developed and you're already so far into life that at this point, no matter what you went through, no matter who you were raised by, how you were raised, no matter what, you were going to end up in the same spot that you are in, and that your motor skills and your motor development would have been exactly the same no matter what influences you would have had in your life. So on to the last stage of development, the theory that I chose for older adults was the perceptual action approach, which basically states that there is a close relationship between your perceptual system and your motor system. And the reason why I related this theory to this stage of development was because these individuals do have a lot more experiences, they've gone through a lot more things in life, they have traumatic experiences, some more than others, and all of these things and all of these fears are going to influence their actions based on their perception of a certain object. So for example, if an older adult does have a traumatic experience with, let's say, a flight of stairs, and they see a flight of stairs ahead of them and they're going to choose their action based on that negative perception. So they're going to choose whether they want to walk up those stairs to even begin with, how they want to walk up those stairs, whether it's walking up them slowly, holding the rail, or any sort of way. These perceptions of this one object is going to affect their actions and their movements. Now that we've covered the theories of development, let's look at the gait cycle through each stage of development. So to kick things off, we have the early childhood development gait cycle, and I really want to focus on the differences between each gait cycle in comparison to an adulthood normal gait cycle, which is what I did when I was looking at each video. So to kick things off, one of the biggest differences that we notice in an early childhood development gait cycle is their balance. They're still growing and the toddler is still developing, so they really don't have much coordination, so they're kind of wobbling all over the place. Their arm swing is very excessive. They use that to really balance themselves out. It's uneven, things of that nature. Another thing that they do tend to do to kind of help with their coordination and their balance is at certain times they will hold their arms out in front of them to avoid them from falling forward or even falling backwards and things like that. Another big difference that we notice is their stance. We notice that a lot of toddlers will step with their toes outwards instead of forward, and they do that because their feet are their base of support. Going back to that main point, because they don't have much coordination, they're still working on trying to find their balance and things of that nature. We also see a huge difference in stride length, and that's obviously a huge obvious reason for their height and things like that. You know, they're still growing, their feet and their legs are really short, so of course their stride length is going to differ from an adulthood gait cycle. And to end things off, one of the biggest differences that we also notice is that a toddler really doesn't have much dorsiflexion throughout the gait cycle. They are very flat-footed, so they're kind of just picking up their foot as a whole and just stepping down, versus an adult gait cycle, we see them go into dorsiflexion and then land on their feet. Some really common abnormalities that we see in the early childhood development are out-toeing, so that's kind of how I said it before, where they step with their toes out. We also notice some toddlers in toeing. So instead of stepping with their toes out, they step with their toes in. And lastly, we obviously see the flat foot position instead of dorsiflexion. So moving on to the next stage of development is childhood development. So now we're going to take a look at a gait cycle of a young child. So similar to a toddler, they are still trying to find that coordination, that balance. So they are still requiring a lot of uneven arm swinging and things of that nature. However, one of the biggest differences that we do see in a childhood development is the excessive plantar flexion. These children tend to walk on their toes. So during their cycle, they're basically in plantar flexion the entire time, which cause a lot of hip and knee inflection throughout the entire cycle. And we also see a big difference in the initial contact. There really is no dorsiflexion, so what we basically see is these children dragging their feet, which causes very minimal knee flexion, and like I said, there is no dorsiflexion. And a few common abnormalities that we do see in the stage of development, one of them being that toe walking that we discussed earlier, where they're basically in plantar flexion the entire gait cycle, which is also called vaulting gait. And then there is also the Trendelenburg gait, so basically where they're wobbling a lot with each step, which we do see in the childhood development just because they are still working on that balance and that coordination, as stated before. So on to the next stage of development is adulthood. So now we'll be looking at the gait cycle through this stage of development. And one of the first biggest differences that we notice is, once again, that balance. And the reason that it's a huge factor is because at this point in your development, you have a lot more control of your body. You are able to balance and have that coordination. So at this point, you have an even controlled arm swing. And throughout the cycle, there is also an evenly distributed amount of hip and knee flexion and extension. And then we also see very minimal trunk movements. So unlike the toddler and the children development phases, where they're wobbling a lot and still trying to figure out their balance and their coordination, in the adult gait cycle, we really don't see that anymore, just because, once again, we do have that balance and that coordination. We also do see that double limb support that we don't see in much of the other phases. And some of the abnormalities that come with this stage of development come with knock-knee gait and waddle. And on to the last stage of development is older adulthood. So now we'll be looking at the gait cycle through this stage of development. And to start things off, one of the biggest differences that we see is the stride length. These individuals already have difficulty walking as is, so their stride length is very small, possibly even smaller than that of a toddler, just because it is very hard for them to even pick up their feet. And in response to that, they have very little to almost no single limb support. So their feet are basically dragging the entire time. In the video that we watched, I did notice that the individual does step with one foot. So basically what she does is she steps forward with one foot and then she drags the other behind her. And unlike a regular adulthood cycle where the single limb support is alternating, this one is just continuous. It's the same foot that's being stepped forward, and it's the same foot that's being dragged. And in response to that, there is very minimal hip and knee. Now, some of the abnormalities that we see during this stage of development include the gait posture. So a lot of these individuals are walking with greater anterior pelvic rotation and an increase in lumbar lordosis. We also see short step gait, so that's basically their stride length, that they have very short stride length, as I had stated before. They also have difficulty initiating gait. So what this states means that they have difficulty getting up and beginning to walk. So those first few steps and initiating that gait cycle, they have a lot of difficulty trying to do so. So now that we've discussed the gait cycle in each stage of development, let's take a look at some of the possible constraints that could come with each stage of development. So in early childhood, some of the constraints that we can see are individual constraints such as height and limb length. A few perceptual constraints can include observing the movement of their parents. So basically they're teaching themselves the movements based on what they observe, but they're not yet able to perform these movements. In the childhood stages of development, same thing, the individual constraints include height and limb length. However, perceptual constraints can include the tasks being performed. So different tasks require different movements and different rules and things like that can affect their gait. In adulthood, some possible constraints include structural constraints, which include weight and muscle mass. However, perceptual constraints can include surface areas of which they are on. So a slippery surface versus a normal flat surface would obviously call for modification of their gait cycle. And then in older adulthood, some of the constraints that we see are functional constraints, such as fear, pain, and experiences that can limit our movements. And that kind of also goes into play with the perceptual constraints. Basically, it can include the memory of traumatic experiences that can affect their gait cycle and the movements that they perform. Overall, we've taken a look at the different theories that try to explain our motor development, and although the textbook does like to focus on the ecological perspective for our motor development simply because they feel that it is the one that best explains it, it is really nice to see how our body develops and how it grows just by looking at the gait cycle and just seeing how our body changes and how it's continuously changing and growing through the different stages of development. I hope you enjoyed my presentation, and thank you.